Okay, well, welcome everyone. We might have a few more folks just trickling in, but we'll get started. So yeah, welcome to the Sati Center Buddhist Chaplaincy Speaker Series, and this is the first one of the new year. So we're excited to be here for a second year and to have you all with us today, and especially to welcome Chenxing Han as our first speaker. So just a little bit about Chenxing. So Chenxing Han is the author of Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, and also One Long Listening, a memoir of grief, friendship, and spiritual care, and numerous articles and book chapters for both academic and mainstream audiences. A frequent speaker and workshop leader at schools, universities, and Buddhist communities across the nation. She has received fellowships from Hedgebrook, Hemera Foundation, the Lens Foundation, and the University of Michigan. Chenxing holds a BA from Stanford University, an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union, a certificate in Buddhist Chaplaincy from the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California. She is a founder of Listening to the Buddhists in Our Backyard, May We Gather, a National Buddhist Memorial for Asian American Ancestors, and Roots and Refuge, an Asian American Buddhist writing retreat. And Chenxing also completed the Sati Center Buddhist Chaplaincy program in 2010. So welcome, Chenxing. Thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And I know Vanessa wasn't able to join us today, but I want to thank her for the invitation to speak. As Jim mentioned, I was part of the 2010 cohort for the Sati Center. So I also just want to thank Gil and Jennifer and Paul as our teachers for that program. And I also must say hello to Reverend Beth Goldring, who is so dear to me. I'm so delighted to see her here. She will feature in my presentation a little bit because I would not be here if it weren't for Beth and Brahma Vihara and the beautiful chaplains that she worked with in Cambodia. And of course, I also want to thank all of you for joining, I believe, from many different geographies and many different time zones and undertaking this program. It's just really delightful to see all of you here. So I was asked to maybe speak for maybe 45 or 50 minutes. I know that's kind of a long time to sit, so please just make yourself comfortable during this time. If you need to get up and stretch, I see some of you have tea, just make yourself comfortable. I'll have some slides and feel free to maybe type questions into the chat. I wish we could all be in person. I often find it's hard to do a PowerPoint while also reading the chat. So if a question comes up or comments, feel free to put that in and maybe we can open it up at the end. And my understanding is we have an hour and a half together for those who want to stay. So the talk portion will be about an hour. So I'll talk, we can do some Q&A. And then I think informally for those who want to stay on and chat some more, there will be that opportunity. So before I open up my PowerPoint, I just want to situate my own perspective a bit and share a little bit about myself. I like to open with the caveat that I am not a badge-wearing chaplain, if you will. I'm not employed in any official capacity as a chaplain anymore, but my training in Buddhist chaplaincy so deeply and totally informs everything I do as a writer, a speaker, an educator. And I'll be certainly presenting from, one perspective as one Asian American Buddhist among many. And let me, at this point, share my PowerPoint, which is probably, too long for the amount of time we have. So there's a middle portion that I might kind of skim over a bit because it's a lot of information. And I have a feeling that you will all get access to this information. I mean, I feel like I started learning about chaplaincy gosh, now more than 15, 16, 17, something like that years ago. And I'm still very much feel like I'm very much learning about it still. So I titled my talk Spiritual Care as Creative Listening, a Buddhist Writer's Perspective. And really my hope is just that this presentation can spark ideas for you, that you can adapt it to your own context. And like I said, please do just take care of yourself and listen to what your body needs. If you need to lie down and, close your eyes because it's a lot of time to look at a screen, please just do so. So part of this talk is inspired by the very long process of writing these two books, each of which took about a decade from inception to publication. Be the Refuge, I began in 2012 as a master's thesis, and I interviewed 89 young adults from different Asian backgrounds, different Buddhist backgrounds, and they were grappling with issues of identity and representation as racial and religious minorities in the US. And I myself was born in China. I was raised in Pennsylvania and Washington State. And then I spent about 16 years in the Bay Area broadly, Berkeley, also the South Bay, Stanford area, which I believe some of you might be based around there. And then also 4 years in Cambodia and Thailand with my husband, Trent Walker. And we recently moved here to Ann Arbor, Michigan. So it's beautiful and a beautiful fall day out here. Beautiful morning. And I was not raised Buddhist, but I really began to explore Buddhism after high school. And I've been really steeping in it, I think, for 20 years now. And I often still feel like a baby Buddhist, but it's something that brings me so much joy, the Buddhist teachings and practices, and really, above all, the friendships and communities among the many sanghas I've been fortunate enough to be connected to. So I identify as a non-sectarian Buddhist who's been quite influenced by both Theravada and Mahayana traditions. And then if there's time, maybe I'll read little snippets from One Long Listening, which I started in 2014. And that came out, I think, just last year, 2023. And it really is a memoir about my education in Buddhist chaplaincy. I can speak more to this at some point, but I think that there's so much more that we need in the literature, in just creative expressions of what does it feel like and look like to be Buddhist spiritual caregivers in training. There's some wonderful material out there, but there's room for so much more. So here's a big shout out to Beth. I think this is the first piece on Buddhism that I ever published, and it was a reflection on my time with Brahma Vihara, the extraordinary Buddhist chaplaincy program that Reverend Goldring ran in Phnom Penh for many years. And I remember Beth sharing with us that at first she'd come in with this idea that she would teach people meditation. And these are people who are very, very ill, many with advanced stages of AIDS or multi-drug resistant TB, many who did not have many financial means. And so they were in hospitals and prisons. And it wasn't just spiritual care that the Brahma Vihara staff and Beth offered. It was also attending to physical needs, medicine, food. But I remember that sharing this story, and she can correct me if I'm misremembering, but how she came in with this notion of, oh, this is what this spiritual needs would be. And it quickly became clear that people were far too weak to do the focus, the concentration, to do this extensive meditation. So instead, she changed tack and she adapted to the local context. And in the summer that I was able to shadow with these extraordinary bodhisattvas who are caring for their fellow country people, fellow Buddhists in Cambodia, they offered a lot of chanting, chants for healing, chants for the end of life, indeed chants after people's passing, and also Reiki, which is really a type of energy healing that began in the early 20th century out of Japan and is quite widespread now. But patients loved receiving this kind of healing energy, and they translated it simply as just a meditation of the hands. And so that was translated into a way that felt inviting and understandable within their Buddhological or theological context, if you were. And to me, that was, not only was it such a privilege to learn about Buddhist chaplaincy from extremely gifted practitioners, if you will, of the art of spiritual care, but also to see what it looks like to translate and to need to adapt and be creative to it's inevitable. We go into everything with assumptions, but what does it mean to have to confront our assumptions and then to, rather than continue to barrel through and impose our assumptions, to actually change? And up to this point, I think I was also very fortunate that I was able to encounter chaplaincy in a majority Buddhist context, which is certainly not the case in the US and in parts of the West where chaplaincy is very much Christian dominated. So I, growing up non-religious with very few family in the US, I immigrated when I was 4 to the US. I hadn't even really heard of chaplaincy. Like it's very common, I suppose, in military and prisons and healthcare and the government, but I had no family who worked in those fields. And so being able to encounter Buddhism in Cambodia was just really eye-opening and really humbling. I just finished my undergrad degree and I realized nothing that I'd studied had prepared me to be with the sick and the dying in a country where I did not speak the language. So I want to acknowledge the places where I trained. So of course, the Sati Center, and its training, I think, really happened right after Cambodia. I started a job in Boston, and then my grandmother became very ill. And I was able to be with her in the last few months of her death. By that point, she was living with us in California and no longer in Shanghai. I was working multiple part-time jobs and also making time for hospice volunteering. And perhaps as many of you did, like did some online research and was so, so grateful to see this program led by such established and revered teachers. So my placement, my internship was at the Sojourn Chaplaincy program at what was then San Francisco General Hospital. And I remember going in with all kinds of assumptions, like, chaplains have to be very serious and, they have to pray during every visit. And luckily, that setting quickly disabused me of these assumptions. It's an incredibly diverse patient population. Most of the time, I was not speaking the same language as the patients in the room. Sometimes I speak Mandarin. Sometimes I was, but the person was in a coma. And so there were other ways to communicate that were not verbal. And again, I think this opened me up to the realization that chaplaincy requires so much translation, actually. Even when you're speaking the same ostensible language of English, we're often translating across culture, across lines of difference. And I also quickly realized, not everyone wants to pray. And so chaplaincy sometimes looks like unsuccessfully attempting to fix the really crappy hospital TV that was next to someone's bed, or then just commiserating with them that, yeah, it really sucks that you get 3 channels here. And sometimes it looked like holding the hand of a man in a coma. And sometimes it did look like prayer, and sometimes it looked like giving someone a hug. And I was really fortunate in my Sati Center cohort to have Sandy Chen Stokes, who's the founder of the Chinese American Coalition for Compassionate Care, CACCC, an organization that's still going strong and just a really wonderful resource for approaching issues of end-of-life care within the Chinese American community, which, like many communities, arguably not just Chinese or not just Asian communities, there can be a lot of stigma around talking about death, around talking about end-of-life issues. And so one example I wanted to raise is that they made these wonderful, delightful heart-to-heart cards. They're called Anxinka, and you can see that they're bilingual. And these cards are on them are printed various values that people might have around the end of life. Things like, I want to revise my will, or I want to talk with someone about my spiritual beliefs, or I don't want to be kept alive on a machine, or this one is particularly common, I think, among Chinese American and Asian Americans. I don't want to be a burden on my family. And this is a picture of the cards in action, that they would host these cafes. So everything always goes better with some tea and drink and food. And people would have these conversations. They would rank the different cards, and it made something quite daunting, actually communal and fun. And I just think this is such a beautiful example of what it looks like to do sort of chaplaincy and spiritual care in the community, and in a way that really it doesn't, again, have to be serious, that can actually bring a certain degree of like levity, maybe even humor and lightness to what might otherwise feel like such a heavy or just, scary topic. So I'd be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge the Institute of Buddhist Studies, the oldest Buddhist seminary in the US, founded in 1949 to train Jodo Shinshu Buddhist ministers. And Shin Buddhists have been in the West Coast in Hawaii before it was part of America. They've been in this country of the US since the 19th century, later 19th century. And so there are some of, I think to me, we can't understand American Buddhism without having a deep understanding of the history and appreciation of the contributions that Shin Buddhists made to the US. And so I was very fortunate that the Sati Center offered credit for programs at IBS. And, I'm really embarrassed now to realize I hadn't heard of it and hadn't known about this extremely important living community, lineage, and history. So what was after graduating from the Institute of Buddhist Studies with essentially a Master's of Divinity or equivalent, a 3-year degree in Master's of Buddhist Studies, I was working in different capacities, and something I certainly noticed was an increased interest in chaplaincy among ministers and also lay people. And also just the question of what does it mean to train in chaplaincy and spiritual care, not just in the maybe conventional settings that we tend to think of, but even just more broadly, how can it be transferred or applied to every field in life? So I was fortunate to do a year-long residency, a CPE, clinical pastoral care residency at Alta Bates. Later, I have a picture of my supervisors who were so influential to my spiritual care journey. My Alta Bates has 3 main campuses, so I was mostly based, not actually at this one pictured here, but at their Oakland branch, working on an oncology unit and a medical renal unit. And I learned an incredible amount from that residency, I guess so much so that I had to spend many years trying to process some of that learning in the form of my second book. And I was also, for various reasons, extremely burned out by the end of this residency. And I was very fortunate to be able to spend a semester afterwards in Taiwan at the Dharma Drum Institute of Liberal Arts, DILA. So I went from a very interfaith setting, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, really collaborative, wonderful space, not majority Buddhist. I think because I was in the Bay Area, maybe more of my patients, family, staff than might be expected are Buddhist. I mean, in the US, only about 1% of people identify as Buddhist. But that said, um, there is still, I think, a lot of interest, curiosity, appreciation about Buddhism, which I recognize is not always the reception that Buddhists will get in various different places, depending on the context. But still going from here to suddenly a space where, the majority language is Mandarin, but there's also Hakka and Hokkien being spoken. This is about an hour from Taipei, east and north, close to the ocean. So fairly rural place. And I was really fortunate to be able to take classes and spend time with a really wonderful professor there who's works with the hospice there. And it was, again, really eye-opening to be at a majority Buddhist place and they had at a certain point asked me to try to explain chaplaincy in the US. And it was an enormous challenge, not only because my Chinese is not very good, but because so many of our terms, I quickly realized, are very much inflected through a Christian lens, since CPE, chaplaincy, really arose out of that. Indeed, the very etymology of the word chaplain has a Christian connection. And so this is a bit meta because I'm presenting and there's me on the screen presenting. That's the wonderful professor on the left who I mentioned, Professor Gu. And I remember they asked me to give this presentation, and it was very overwhelming, I think, probably for all of us, because in a way it's impossible, right, to learn about chaplaincy through a 2-hour presentation or the hour we have today. And so I hope this presentation is just one seed or, one moment that can offer inspiration and encouragement. So this actual this moment made it into the first part of my memoir. And actually some of these slides are from that very presentation, though, they're just in English and not in Chinese as I had presented it there. But once again, this reminded me just not to take this word chaplain for granted, or this notion of chaplaincy. Like, what is chaplaincy? What does it mean? I think it's, as we say in Buddhism, so much everything we do is co-created, right? And so I think of chaplaincy now, all of you are part of this field and able to shape what form it takes. What are the many different creative and manifest expressions of chaplaincy? So this is the outline for the talk. I think it's a little overly ambitious, and so I'll just skim a little bit, and I want to focus kind of more towards the very end, actually, and on the Buddhist specific portions. I'm going to look at the time. I think about 20, speak for about 20 or 25 more minutes. One thing I just did want to name is I wanted to just zoom out a little bit, and particularly to my field of thinking about Asian American religions. So this is a really wonderful recent Pew Forum report. And actually, there's a lot of really accessible information from the Pew Forum that just gives us a little bit bigger picture of religion. And I sometimes like to just keep this bigger sociological picture in mind, statistical picture, knowing that, of course, none of us are statistics, but it can be helpful to know just general trends in your particular area or in the nation. And since a lot of my work is with young people and young adults, I'm particularly intrigued by those who are spiritual but not religious, or like here it says, a rising share who have no religion, but might be close to a religious tradition for reasons of family and culture. So I won't go into too much detail. This is actually just detailing how the report was done. This slide lists what National Geographic considers to be the countries in Asia, which is all to say, I think that even this very term, Asian American, is heavily contested. How do we define who is Asian American? That's something I think about a lot in my writing, my educating work, but also in a chaplaincy context, that just because someone looks a certain way, I don't want to assume that they identify a certain way. Again, sort of the diversity is totally, mind-boggling when we encounter it. Here's a New York Times piece on the number of Asian Americans, and you'll see that there's a category for Asian and Black. And so again, how do we define this category? How do we consider people who are mixed race? Asian and white is here. I'm always very interested in being able to play with the limits of our categories, the limits and the possibilities of our categories, and to understand this. One thing I do think that, is quite interesting about these lists is that several of these countries, whether especially places like Cambodia or Thailand or Laos, are majority Buddhist countries, like 95% and above, and other places might be a bit more mixed. So there's going to be different demographics, different forms of Buddhism in all of these countries. And of course, there's immigrants from all of these countries and more than are on this list, who we might encounter through our spiritual care work. And many of them may not be Buddhist, since immigration patterns very much influence, the proportion of who is Buddhist in this country. So for example, Korean Americans are much, much more likely to be Christian than Buddhist, versus in Korea, the number of Christians and Buddhists are more balanced. So this is all just things that I keep in the back of my mind. I think about things like legislation, like the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, that immigration act that really changed the demographics of the US. I think much more than the people who wrote the act actually thought it would, but that really opened the doors to a lot of Asian immigration, but also of particular socioeconomic classes. So all of this gets, expressed in the settings that we work in. And I think that's one thing I love about chaplaincy, is that we get to learn all the time about individual people, their family systems, our patients, the staff at the hospital, but then also we can learn about these broader histories, these broader pieces of legislation that may seem long ago, but that have actually real impact, material impact on what we encounter in the hospital, right? So for me to know that the 1965 Immigration Act was something that came, almost half a century after the 1924 Asian Exclusion Act, helps me understand different demographics, helps me understand that why did I encounter more recent immigrants in the hospital versus people, Asian Americans who've been here 4, 5, 6 generations in this country. They're certainly here, but if you're barred by the country from citizenship or immigrating, then that's going to affect who you see in our spaces. So I'll just skip through some of these slides. It's just in the interest of time. This slide is just noting that 6 in 10 Vietnamese and Japanese Americans say they're Buddhist or feel close to Buddhism. And I also found this finding really interesting, that few Asian American Buddhists attend religious services regularly, but most worship at a home altar or shrine. And for me, this slide is just a reminder, again, to examine what our own assumptions about religion or spirituality might be. If we measure everything by sort of more Christian metrics, how often do you attend church? We may actually be really missing out on very important spiritual and religious dimensions. And so, I always like to work in the hospital, like look for little cues, whether maybe someone was wearing mala beads, or maybe there was just a little, Guanyin statue that they'd put in, or maybe I might offer if that might be meaningful, depending on the type of Buddhist. And that's a whole other topic of the huge diversity of forms of Buddhism. And certainly that's true for other religions as well. But I think in Western context in particular, a particular challenge, like if we're fortunate enough even to, encounter other Buddhists, is that there's so many different kinds of Buddhists. So the care I might offer to a Soka Gakkai Buddhist might look different than a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. And I think we can learn, and that takes time, and we don't have to be experts, fortunately. Like the beauty of just asking a question, or, oh, I'm Buddhist, but a different kind of Buddhist. Could you share more about, what Buddhism means to you? I think is always can be a beautiful question to open up more conversation. So I wanted to speak for a moment about this, how we translate chaplain and chaplaincy. And maybe it might be fun for me just to read a very short passage from page 10 of my memoir. And this is what I was grappling with a lot as someone who was just trying to figure out, how do I explain what it means to be a chaplain to people who've never heard that word before? So, my aunt helps me find the words to introduce myself to Chinese-speaking patients at the hospital. This is the aunt who lives in Shanghai, who once thoroughly trounced me at a game of Scrabble when she visited us in Seattle. Only teenage hubris can explain my surprise at having lost to a woman who read dictionaries cover to cover during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Did I mention she's a translator and writer? We agree that 宗教师, which is the second bullet point here, religious teacher, sounds too literal, while 精神支持, spiritual supporter, sounds a bit stiff, the fourth bullet point. She muses, in Chinese, 精神疏导 or 心理疏导 is quite an occupational term, but 关怀 may sound more humane. Alternatively, you can use 人文关怀 or 心灵关怀, which are both suitable in this case, but may be too extensive in meaning. 精神人员 is awkward for non-believers, but still embraces a broader sense than 牧师, which is strictly used in the Christian context. 牧师, shepherd teacher, is the translation I encounter most often, but the Lord is not my shepherd, and a hospital chaplain's flock is not exclusively Christian, especially not here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I end up explaining not who I am, but what I do. 精神与心理关怀, or simply 关怀, the chaplain's job distilled to a single word, care. So as I mentioned, that word chaplain has this etymology that actually relates to the story of the cloak of St. Martin from Capella. And I'm trying to think, let me just check. I read about this in the memoir too, briefly. So I'll just read it because it's just a few bullet points. This is from the presentation I gave in Taiwan. St. Martin of Tours, or why a cloak? This 4th century Christian saint was the Bishop of Tours. Here we go. His shrine in France became a famous stopping point for pilgrims. Pre-sainthood, as a soldier in the Roman army stationed in Gaul, modern-day France, Martin met a beggar clad only in rags in the depth of winter. Using his military sword to cut his cloak in two, Martin gave one half to the beggar. He dreamed of Jesus wearing half a cloak. Upon waking, Martin's cloak had become whole. The cloak became a relic. The priest who cared for the cloak in its reliquary was called a capellanu. Eventually, priests who served the military were called capellani. The French translation is chapelain, from which the English word chaplain is derived. Some chaplains use this metaphor to show how we comfort those we serve. We give others a part of, but not our entire cloak, because it's no use freezing to death ourselves. So for me, it was really interesting to learn about this history of chaplaincy and from this perspective. And I think we could write a whole alternative history of Buddhist chaplaincy, indigenous to parts of Asia and indigenous to Asian diasporic communities across the world. But I appreciated, and maybe this is a good point to mention, that I think I certainly found this to be the case, especially at the beginning of a chaplaincy journey, like the beginning of our CPE. We were all so eager to be of service, to be of help. And it was very easy to burn out, to offer people our whole cloaks, or to make sure they were fed and forget to nourish ourselves. And so I still remember so many of my chaplaincy teachers just reminding us over and over that we really must be unwavering in our self-care, whatever that looks like. And I think if you remember nothing else from this talk, if that kind of invitation or permission or reminder stays with you, I hope that that's of use. I continue to find that to be of use, especially for those of us who tend to overdo it. So I'm going to skip through these next portions, which is thinking about very early origins of chaplaincy in the US military, although I might pause here to just mention that excuse me, it was not until I believe 1990 that the US military finally made plans for the inclusion of Buddhist chaplains. And we know that the 442nd Regiment in 1944 during World War II, this was believed to be the first Buddhist service ever delivered in an Army installation in the US. And I highly recommend Dr. Reverend Duncan Rukin Williams' book, American Sutra, for those who want to learn more about the history of American Buddhists during this era, and just the Japanese American Buddhists, and practicing their faith while incarcerated behind barbed wire, while serving in the military. I think that the field of chaplaincy is still doing a lot to catch up with the huge religious pluralism that is part of the fact of the US. And I think that it's so wonderful to have this growing field of Buddhist chaplaincy, which, as I said, again, is super challenging because so much diversity is under this umbrella of Buddhism, even just here in the US. Places like LA may be like one of the most diverse Buddhist cities in the world, that there's just always so much to learn about other Buddhists of different backgrounds than ours. So again, I'll skip the government part, although I do want to just celebrate the Oshitas, who are the Buddhist chaplains for the California State Assembly. I don't believe at the federal level there has yet been a Buddhist chaplain installed. Keep going. And I think I'll skip this portion too, but all to say that thinking about the start of hospital chaplaincy, and chaplaincy has long had a connection to mental health care. So I think that that really also informs the lineage, informs the pedagogy of how we learn. And just want to note that there's just so many settings for chaplaincy today. I think that, this is really just some of them, whether it's the military, the police, university settings, sports teams, many workplaces, large workplaces. I mean, like Tyson Chicken, you would probably need a chaplain if you worked there. Hospitals and hospice, that there's even animal chaplaincy. Recently, we've heard a lot more about movement chaplaincy to support people who are part of social movements, whether that's Black Lives Matter or other movements. There's chaplaincy to support the homeless, the unhoused, chaplaincy in the prison context, fire chaplains. I mean, it's sort of like where people are spiritual beings. And so wherever there are people there, and maybe animals more broadly, there is a need for spiritual care. And maybe we could extend that even I'm going to actually skip through this slide. We could extend that even to the natural world, to the trees. I think it's so inspiring to see this increasing interest in Buddhist eco-chaplaincy. So I think, again, chaplaincy, this field of spiritual care, is always shifting and changing, and it needs to be as people, the different needs and crises of our time are speaking to people differently. And certainly I know among many people of all ages, but especially among young people, there can be so much despair and fear around climate change and around the huge crises that we're seeing as a result of it. So he's a Buddhist eco-chaplaincy. There's so many wonderful people in this field that I think the Sati Center can share more about. And then I think I might altogether skip this portion on how our chaplains trained, just because it's so much information and other people can probably present it better than I can. But again, to say that there are different national level organizations, there's publications where sadly Buddhist related publications are very few and far between. So hopefully we can collectively kind of address that issue. There's all kinds of requirements for board certification if you choose to go that route. I think there's these wonderful Buddhist institutes, places, and particularly places like Institute of Buddhist Studies or University of the West in Europa, which are, there's are places that were founded by Buddhists, and then places like Harvard Divinity School, where Buddhists are part of a broader theological context. So here's just a map of some of the places where people might go to train in Buddhist chaplaincy. So again, I'll just skip through this portion. And CPE, founders. Yes, as I mentioned when I talked about translation, I would actually carry this around with me in addition to my pager. And that, again, I couldn't really figure out a way to translate who I was as a chaplain. I didn't want to use this Christian term, both because it certainly didn't suit me, and also because I didn't want to turn away Chinese speakers who weren't Christian. And so I actually wrote the 精神与心理关怀, like care of the spirit or care of the heart and mind. And I put this peanut butter and jelly sandwich in here. I read about this in the memoir because it relates again to this recommendation of self-care. Very memorably, one of the chaplain Stevie at our hospital, who we kind of just called him the mayor of the hospital. He'd been a chaplain for so long, everybody knew him. He would just go through the halls and say hello to everybody. How are you doing? How's your daughter? Is your grandma out of the hospital? Like, just everywhere he went, it was so fun to shadow him because everyone just felt such like warmth and love. And I remember he was teaching us about something that we would sometimes have to do is viewings, which is when a family member had passed away and people requested to see the body of their loved one. And so, of course, we were very nervous about this, not having done this before, not knowing how family members would act. And Stevie mentioned a time when Chaplain Stevie said he once was just running from place to place, and he realized he needed to eat. And he was also setting up the viewing, just making sure that the deceased eyes were closed, that they, looked good for the family. And he was holding a peanut butter jelly sandwich in one hand, eating it, and, helping to arrange the room in the other. And, it wasn't, for him, it was not morbid. And of course, he meant no disrespect, but he realized he was not going to be of much help to this family if he wasn't cared for and nourished himself. So that story always stuck with me. It was like, remember to keep half the cloak at least, and remember to always, feed yourself. And, he had also started this clothing closet for our patients, many of whom were unhoused. And so he didn't ever want them to leave the hospital just wearing the hospital gown. And so that also became an act of spiritual care, of supporting people's well-being and dignity. And I put hot water on here because at our hospital, sadly, there were no hot water dispensers. And so often, especially with Asian patients, I found myself sometimes doing very simple spiritual care, like getting water and just microwaving it and just drinking something that was warming. Some of these little ways that we can support people by being culturally attuned to what their needs are. Again, it doesn't always have to look like big prayers or something that looks really flashy. I think so much of chaplaincy and spiritual care is in those really just intimate and quiet moments of being attuned to other people's needs while also never neglecting what our own needs are. So I'll skip through this, but this was my wonderful peer group. And as I mentioned, I did want to honor my supervisors who I I would not be here without them. I would not have published any books without them. So I just want to celebrate Reverend Carrie Buckner and Reverend Venetia Rayford, who I got to see recently on a trip to Atlanta, which is so meaningful. Also, Lavera Crawley, just amazing, amazing supervisors. And something I loved about chaplaincy is that, especially in the hospital setting, is that it was just such a collaborative process. So this kind of gives you a sense of, I think it's so important not to undertake this work alone. And even if we're not in hospital settings, to really find multiple, be part of a web of support, right? To be part of multiple streams of support and nourishment. What am I doing on time? Okay. So we're coming towards the end. These are some books on chaplaincy, some Buddhist chaplaincy books, some more recent Buddhist chaplaincy books. So a lot of resources that are there, a lot that's emerging, a lot that is still to be written, I think. And I have this slide, but I think rather than focusing on that, I would just want to end my talk with, well, first a picture of Beth working in Cambodia on the bottom right. On the top left, there's in a Taiwanese setting, one of monastic Huimin Bhikshu is doing a teaching demonstration for some Buddhist chaplains. Here you'll see they're mostly nuns in training. Here in Japan, there's an interfaith chaplaincy training at Tohoku University. So for me, I've always found it instructive to remember, chaplaincy is happening in Britain and throughout Europe and throughout the North America, South America, but also throughout Asia and these places where, Buddhism has been for so many centuries, for millennia. And I've always found it instructive to keep this broad view and to see, especially as Buddhist chaplains, what we can learn from our peers in Asia, from our peers, in these Buddhist countries or these Buddhist settings. Oops. Next slide. The Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, which many of you might know of, is a really wonderful website with a lot of different webinars and resources. So highly recommended as a resource just for learning about different aspects of chaplaincy. So here's an example of something focused a bit more on an international perspective of Buddhist chaplaincy. And for me, again, as I mentioned, I think it's also just important to think about how our different geographic locations, of course, this is very US centric, but interpret for your own context as well. If you're outside of the US, people who might say they're highly religious versus those who aren't. And I think that spiritual care, how do we offer spiritual care when, to people who may not consider themselves religious? And this was the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab had actually did a survey in 2012 or 2022, so just a couple years ago, that asked people to describe chaplains. And it was actually very promising, I think, that a lot of these very positive traits, most people said it was a really valuable experience. And they almost universally ascribed these positive qualities. Relatively few said that the chaplain was intrusive or pushy or condescending. So I think all this is to say that there's, of course, a lot of need for chaplaincy. And of course, so much of the need is also, again, translating what it means to be a chaplain in a way that makes sense to the people we're working with, the populations we're working with, knowing that the term can come with a lot of baggage, right? I know I would sometimes walk into a room and people would think like the Grim Reaper had walked in, like they would just they're like, I'm not dying yet. And I was like, oh, don't worry, I don't think I am either, or I think sometimes humor can diffuse that situation. Or someone once said to me like, oh, I thought you'd be an old fart. And I said, yeah, give me a few years and I'll get there eventually. But I think also when we diversify the field of what chaplaincy is, it also just expands people's notion of who can be a chaplain and what does a chaplain look like. Here's an image, I think, during this COVID period, during the most acute time of the pandemic. And I think for me, I am so just always infinitely grateful for Buddhism, for the triple gem of the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha. This is in Thailand in this context, and the monks are praying for people's well-being during the COVID pandemic. I know many Buddhist Sanghas donated masks to different areas. And so I think just for me, there's so many resources within the Buddhist tradition, from prayer to meditation to chanting to, even we see this blessing thread that is tying the Buddha to the monks to, I think there'd be people in the audience who would be holding these blessing threads. So, and there's both very tangible and, less tangible ways that our Buddhist practices can, always be providing spiritual care. Again, whether or not we wear a badge that says chaplain. This is, we can see this, the last scene in action. Here you have Sri Lankan monastics at the bedside of a deceased with this blessing thread. I think many know the story of Kisa Gotami, for which I think I have time to briefly summarize the story for those who haven't heard about the story of Kisa Gotami and the mustard seed. Many Buddhist chaplains talk about this parable as a way to think about maybe the Buddha himself as a chaplain, as a spiritual caregiver. And in this case, Kisa Gotami had been born into a poor family and married into a wealthier family that really looked down upon her until finally she gave birth to a son. And then she finally had some standing in the family. But tragically, the boy died when he was very young, and she was just completely deranged with her grief, going from house to house asking for medicine to revive the corpse of her son, to revive her baby. And finally, someone took pity on her and told her to go see the Buddha. And the Buddha said, "Oh, okay, well, I can give some medicine for you." And he asked her, please get a handful of mustard seed from a household. And mustard seed is like what, salt or pepper for us in our households. Everyone has it. And she's like, "Of course, that will be no problem." And he said, "Oh, but it must be from a household that has never experienced death or never experienced loss." And so predictably, Kisagotami would go to a house and say, "Oh, of course, we'd be happy to give you some mustard seed." And then she would ask, "Has anyone died?" And of course, at every single household, there had been a loss, right? Someone had said, "Oh, my brother just last week," or "My grandfather last year," or "I too just lost a child maybe 20 years ago," but still the grief feels as fresh as if it was yesterday sometimes, right? And so at the end of this, Kisago to me came to realize that her suffering, her grief, her loss, she was not alone in it. And eventually she ordains into the Buddhist order. She achieves enlightenment. There's so many stories within the Buddhist tradition that I think can offer encouragement and inspiration. Um, the Kuchivikara Vata Sutta about the monk with dysentery, and many of the fellow monks actually are not wanting to take care of this monk, and the Buddha himself tends to the monk, despite the diarrhea, despite the bodily fluids, and then the Buddha scolds the monks, saying, this is, if you don't tend to one another, who will tend to you? This is your family. This sangha is your family. I always so here's an image from depicting that particular sutta, this is a mural image of the Buddha attending to the monk with dysentery. I myself find a lot of inspiration in Theravada Buddhist temples at the temple murals. It's pretty much any Theravada Buddhist temple in the US you go to, or in Southeast Asia, will have these gorgeous murals, which are, I think, wonderful for education. And just, I love to sit there and breathe and meditate with these images. And here I always love to see, there's often depictions of, maybe one or more monks who are crying at the Buddha's parinirvana, at his passing. And we know in the sutras, Ananda, the cousin of the Buddha, his closest attendant, was weeping at the, so bereft at the loss of his teacher. And I think for me, I just love this scene because it's a reminder that some maybe of the broader stereotypes we might encounter about Buddhism, that it's very serious or that it's very detached or it's all about emptiness. I think there's a real important and strong place for emotions in Buddhism. And yeah, I think that they, in a way you could argue that Kisago to me, like those emotions that she felt, as difficult as they were, really eventually opened the door for her to liberation. And so they're a form of connection. And I think for me, steeping in chaplaincy and Buddhism has actually helped me kind of be more intimate with the storm of different emotions that we experience as human beings and these very unpredictable lives that we lead. I think also, patients may not be Buddhist, but a lot of Buddhist imagery or metaphors can be resonant even for people who aren't Buddhist. Like, for example, no mud, no lotus. We know that lotuses as a symbol of enlightenment and awakening in Buddhism, they only grow in muddy water. And so some people, like the Venerable late Thich Nhat Hanh, talk about the lotus as that as a symbol for, this samsaric world. It's this mud, it's this difficulties that we encounter that actually provide the nutriment and the nutrients and maybe the motivation we need to alleviate suffering, our own as well as others' suffering. I think too, Buddhism gives us rituals. This is an image from the Shinyo Lantern Floating Festival in Hawaii, which is held every year by the Shinyo En Foundation. I think like tens of thousands of people go for this ritual. So whether or not people are Buddhist, but that importance of ritual, I think, whether for Buddhists, non-Buddhists alike, can be so important in these times of grief. And so I think I don't want to take up too much more time, so I'm going to skip talking about May We Gather, though I think it is very much related. This was a Buddhist pilgrimage and ritual memorial ceremony that I, along with Reverend Duncan Williams, Dr. Funi Su, and many, many people who helped, held this ceremony this year in California, and then prior to that, 3 years ago, online, but in Los Angeles. This was to commemorate the Atlanta spa shootings of that happened in 2021, where 6 Asian women and 2 others were killed in a mass shooting. And that really, I think it was during the pandemic, and there was a rising anti-Asian violence at the time. There was vandalization of Buddhist temples happening, and we wanted to bring people together in a memorial of acknowledging the harm and also healing many of the difficult emotions, the fear, the anger, the sorrow that we were feeling during that time. And for me, this is again such a powerful reminder of the power of ritual, of embodied practice in community. We chose the image of the thousand-armed Guanyin as, many-headed, thousand-armed Guanyin. And I love this image. It's really, personally very inspiring. Among the chants that I do always daily is a chant to Guanyin or Avalokiteshvara, who hears the cries of suffering in the world and addresses them with the various tools. And so I suppose this image is a good one to think about, what it means to be a chaplain, that we learn these different tools, we practice with them, we have our own practice with our own communities, we find ourselves rooted in that, and then we go out in the world to our various settings and offer the care that we have. And maybe much like CPE, this action reflection model, I can think of this image as the people are going out and then maybe they come back. And so we're always in these cycles of renewal. It's so important to renew our own just well-being, physical, mental, spiritual, psychological, all of the dimensions, and to continually be in this process, to be in community. So I wanted to return to this because I just wanted to acknowledge that I wouldn't have written these books without my supervisors who said to me, chaplaincy needs writers too. And up to that point, I'd sort of felt like, oh, I was a bit of a failed writer because I hadn't written these books I wanted to write. I was also a bit of a failed chaplain because I wasn't going to go into a full-time professional chaplaincy position. And it was that simple phrase from my supervisors, chaplaincy needs writers too, that helped me stop seeing these things in such dualistic ways and helped open me to the possibility that each of you in this room has so many different gifts, and maybe you haven't thought to connect that to chaplaincy. Maybe you've thought, oh, that's separate from my sphere of spiritual care. But I think arguably that's what makes you uniquely, there's as many ways to do chaplaincy as there are chaplains. Right. And so each of you will find a unique voice and expression of how you do spiritual care that will be constantly changing. And I think everything that has happened in your life has brought you to this moment. And this training that unfurls with this wonderful community of peers, I hope will continue to enrich that journey for you. So I just wanted to briefly squeeze in this. This is a New Yorker piece that I really recommend reading. It's very short, but it's so delightful to me that there's this program at Princeton that I think we can do this program in our daily lives. But I think like in our daily lives, we encounter a lot of these hidden chaplains. And sometimes it's the lunch lady at the, who's scanning the dining cards at the dining room, who just has a warm smile for everybody. For me, I know one of the people who works at my local YMCA and is always listening to gospel music while cleaning the pool when I go for a swim. Like, she is a hidden chaplain in my life. So I think that there's all these hidden chaplains out there. Again, not badge wearing chaplains. And then there's also ways we can, regardless of how little or how much training we have, be these hidden chaplains, bring some measure of just like spiritual joy or relief to people in our lives. Yep, so here's just another image from that hidden chaplains. And then I think I want to just end actually on a project that I felt really fortunate to have the opportunity to be a part of, called Listening to the Buddhists in Our Backyard. I co-founded this with my co-teacher, Andy Husio, who's on the very left with his little daughter there, who he's holding. And in this project for 3 years, it was based in Massachusetts, a little bit north of Boston. And we had an opportunity to learn about Buddhism by, well, as it says, listening to the Buddhists in our backyard. And the students, we could have learned about Buddhism by reading about the Four Noble Truths and by reading all these textbooks. But as it turned out, there were a lot of Buddhist temples, within a 20-minute drive of our school: Thai, Lao, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Chinese. And, sometimes I hear from people who think they're in a more rural area, a more remote area. I was just did give a talk and online talk for some folks in Nebraska, and they have a local Vietnamese temple. So sometimes people are quite surprised by what they discover of the Buddhists in their backyard. But I always like to end on this slide because I learned so much from the students, and also, well, from the Buddhist communities whom we encountered, who would invite us to be with them for 3 or 4 hours at a time, right? I think that in a way, the students were receiving spiritual care at these temples. I know as co-teachers, we were certainly receiving spiritual care, and we're still deeply connected to these temples, even though I don't live in Massachusetts. Andy no longer lives in Massachusetts. But all this to me is to say that it's just another reminder. Buddhism is so broad, so diverse, and sometimes the best way to learn is really just to listen and attune to, right, who's really here in our backyard. And here I think you could replace Buddhists with anything else. But I'm using Buddhists as an example since I'm talking to a group of Buddhists. So I hope that this presentation has been, offered some encouragement or inspiration around these, what to me are such core dimensions of chaplaincy, which are the listening to others, listening to ourselves, this action and reflection, this self-care piece, to creativity, spontaneity, change, comfort with not knowing. That's such a foundational dimension of chaplaincy. And then I hope that it inspires you to think about translation as well as untranslatability. What does it mean to move between cultures, to translate across difference, also to be comfortable, again, with not knowing about what can't be translated in the different chaplaincy contexts. And finally, I wish for all of you a long-term practice of cultivating ease and curiosity around spirituality in yourself and in those that you encounter. So thank you so much for your kind and attentive listening, and I will end the presentation here. Thank you.